October 12, 1944. 0640 hours. Railway siding, Yorkshire, England. Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stepped from the cattle car into the drizzling English rain. His hands were bound, exhausted from 3 days of transport across the Channel and through the countryside. Around him, 200 German prisoners shuffled into formation, men from the 352nd Infantry Division, captured after weeks of fighting in Normandy. Expecting the worst from their British captors, the propaganda had been explicit. The British Empire, built on colonial brutality, would show no mercy to German prisoners. Expect beatings, starvation, forced labor unto death. The broadcasts from Berlin had been clear: better to die fighting than face what the British would do to captured soldiers. Werner looked around for the brutality he'd been promised. Instead, he saw order. British guards stood in neat formations, rifles held properly, uniforms clean despite the weather. No shouting. No chaos. Just quiet, professional military discipline that reminded Werner, uncomfortably, of German standards. The standards his shattered division had abandoned during the desperate retreat through France. A British sergeant approached, middle-aged, with a steady gaze that suggested he'd seen everything war could offer and remained unimpressed by all of it. He spoke in accented but comprehensible German. You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp. Anyone who causes trouble will be disciplined. Anyone who cooperates will be treated correctly. Is this understood? The tone wasn't cruel or kind. It was simply matter-of-fact. Soldiers addressing soldiers. Werner found himself nodding before he realized he was taking orders from the enemy. The search was thorough but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued and stored. Wounded prisoners were separated for immediate medical attention. Then came water, British soldiers moving down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who'd been their enemies days earlier. Werner drank. The water was cold and clean. And he realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that his first experience of British captivity contradicted every warning he'd received. No beatings. No starvation. Just professional military procedure executed with the calm efficiency that characterized everything British. As trucks arrived to transport them to the camp, Werner overheard 2 British guards talking in English he partially understood. One said something about poor bastards, and the other replied, Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly. That phrase, treat them accordingly, would define Werner's next 18 months in British captivity, teaching him uncomfortable truths about the regime he'd fought for and the civilization he'd been taught to despise. The system of decency. Britain's POW camp system was built on principles that balanced security with fundamental respect for prisoners as human beings. By 1944, Britain held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. The system operated under clear directives. Prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, worked within legal parameters, fed adequately, housed properly, and disciplined firmly but fairly. This wasn't sentiment. It was calculated policy with multiple objectives. Security. Well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems than abused ones. Intelligence. Cooperative prisoners provided valuable information. Diplomacy. Proper treatment ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps. Morality. Britain was fighting for civilization, which meant maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies. The British philosophy. The approach to guarding German prisoners reflected deeply held British military and cultural values about proper conduct, even in war. British guards, many veterans of North Africa, Italy, or France, operated under clear directives that emphasized maintaining discipline without descending into cruelty. The cultural expectation was restraint. You demonstrated superiority not through brutality, but through unshakable composure and adherence to standards. Sergeant Major William Thompson, who supervised guards at Camp 174 in Lancashire, articulated this philosophy. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities. But they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that. This restrained approach created distinctive camp atmospheres. Guards didn't fraternize with prisoners but showed professional courtesy. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. Violations of rules resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or reduced privileges, but not physical abuse. The contrast with Nazi treatment of prisoners was absolute and intentional. Britain was demonstrating that democratic civilization could maintain moral standards even under war's pressures, a pointed refutation of Nazi claims that democracies were weak and decadent. The arrival experience. 4 German prisoners arriving at British camps, the first days created profound cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. Werner Hartmann's transport arrived at Camp 174 in Lancashire on October 13th. The facility held approximately 2,000 prisoners in wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Nothing luxurious, but weatherproof, organized, clean. Processing was systematic. Documentation, medical examination, assignment to barracks, explanation of camp rules. Everything conducted in German by British personnel who'd learned the language or through interpreters. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding large numbers of German prisoners and prepared accordingly. The first meal was an education. Werner expected starvation rations. The propaganda had promised British would deliberately starve German prisoners. Instead, dinner was adequate: bread, stew with actual meat, tea, even margarine. More food than Werner's unit had been receiving during the final weeks of fighting in Normandy. "I couldn't understand it," Werner recalled in a 1987 interview. "We'd been told the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, the first night we received more food than we'd seen in weeks, slept in dry barracks with real beds, and weren't beaten or abused." The disconnect between what we'd expected and what we experienced was so profound that some prisoners thought it must be temporary, that the real brutality would start once we'd been softened up. It never came. The camp rules. The camp rules were posted in German and explained clearly. Work assignments mandatory unless medically excused. Cooperation required. Defiance punished. Escape attempts would be prevented. Successful escapees would be recaptured. Medical care provided to all. Religious services permitted. Letter writing allowed under censorship. No fraternization with guards. Discipline maintained through orderly procedures. The rules weren't kind, but they were fair, applied equally to all prisoners without favoritism or arbitrary cruelty. The work program. German prisoners were assigned work, primarily agricultural labor and reconstruction projects that was legal under Geneva Conventions and beneficial to Britain's war-strained economy. The assignments were practical: harvesting crops, repairing farm buildings, clearing land, working in forestry. Britain faced severe labor shortages with millions of men in military service. German POWs provided an essential workforce for agriculture and basic construction. The work was hard but not deliberately cruel. Prisoners worked 8-hour days, received additional rations for manual labor, and were provided adequate tools and supervision. British farmers who supervised prisoner work details were instructed to treat them fairly, get honest work from them, but don't abuse them. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt worked on a farm in Kent for 14 months. "We harvested crops, repaired fences, helped with livestock. The work was hard. I was a clerk before the war, not a farmer, but not impossible." The British farmer who supervised us was stern but fair. He showed us how to do tasks properly, expected competent work, and didn't tolerate laziness. But he also brought us tea during breaks and never raised his hand to anyone. It was honest work for honest treatment. This work program created unexpected interactions between German prisoners and British civilians. Farmers who initially viewed prisoners with hostility often developed grudging respect for men who worked diligently and behaved properly. Some prisoners learned English through daily contact with supervisors. Occasionally, British civilians would share food or cigarettes, gestures that contradicted German propaganda about British hatred for Germans. The medical care. Sick and wounded German prisoners receiving British medical treatment experienced another contradiction to propaganda. Camp 174's medical facility was run by British Army doctors and nurses who treated German patients with the same professional standards applied to British soldiers. Wounded prisoners received surgeries, medications, and rehabilitation. Sick prisoners got proper diagnosis and treatment. Medical care was competent and non-discriminatory. Werner Hartmann developed pneumonia during his first winter in captivity. The British medical officer prescribed sulfur drugs, bed rest, and extra rations. A British nurse monitored his recovery, adjusting treatment as needed. Within 2 weeks, Werner had recovered fully. "They saved my life," Werner stated matter-of-factly. "I'd have died from pneumonia without proper medicine. The British gave me antibiotics, professional care, and time to recover. They didn't have to. I was an enemy prisoner, no value to them. But they treated illness as a medical problem requiring medical solution, not as an opportunity to let prisoners die. That professionalism impressed me deeply. The medical statistics documented systematic care. Prisoners receiving medical treatment, 1944 to 46, approximately 80,000. Surgical procedures on prisoners, over 5,000. Mortality from disease, less than 0.3%, lower than the civilian population due to camp sanitation and medical access. Medications provided, antibiotics, pain relief, antimalarials, vitamins. This medical care served British interests. Healthy prisoners worked more effectively and caused fewer administrative problems. But it also demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even when that life belonged to enemy soldiers. The restraint. What impressed German prisoners most wasn't kindness. It was consistent, unshakable British restraint in circumstances where cruelty would have been understandable. British guards had reasons to hate German prisoners. Many had lost friends to German weapons. Some had seen the devastation of the London Blitz or other bombing campaigns. They knew what concentration camps contained. Yet they maintained professional distance and fair treatment. When a British guard at Camp 174 struck a German prisoner during an argument, the guard was disciplined, reduced in rank, and reassigned. The camp commander explained to assembled prisoners. That man violated military discipline by losing control. In the British Army, we maintain standards regardless of circumstance. You will be treated correctly, not because you deserve it, but because we demand it of ourselves. This self-discipline, treating prisoners properly because British standards required it rather than because prisoners earn it, was psychologically devastating to Nazi propaganda about democratic weakness. German prisoners couldn't interpret consistent fairness as weakness when it was clearly backed by military competence and unshakable authority. Sergeant Major Thompson described the philosophy. These men fought for evil, yes. They killed our soldiers, yes. But we don't lower ourselves to their level. We demonstrate superiority not through cruelty, but through maintaining civilized standards they abandoned. When a German prisoner sees British guards treating him fairly despite having every reason to hate him, that teaches him more about civilization's strength than any beating could. The Christmas service. December 1944 brought an incident that crystallized the British approach to German prisoners. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments, gathered for religious observance, and sang traditional hymns. On Christmas Eve, prisoners gathered for a Protestant service. They sang Still Nacht, Silent Night, in German. The song drifted across the camp in the cold winter air. British guards standing watch outside stopped and listened in silence. When the song ended, several guards quietly applauded. One sergeant entered the barracks afterward and distributed cigarettes and biscuits, not required by regulations, but a gesture of common humanity during the holidays. Werner Hartmann remembered the moment. We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we'd tried to kill. The British guards could have mocked us or forbidden the service. Instead, they respected it. When that sergeant came in with cigarettes, saying Happy Christmas, lads, I understood something fundamental had changed. These weren't the barbarians we'd been taught to expect. They were civilized men treating defeated enemies with dignity we hadn't shown anyone during the war. The Christmas service became emblematic of British camp policy: maintain security and discipline, but recognize prisoners' humanity within those constraints. It was neither cruel nor soft. It was simply decent. The letters home. German prisoners, allowed to write letters home, created opportunities for propaganda collapse to spread beyond camps. The letters described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions, contradicting Nazi broadcasts about Allied brutality toward prisoners. When families in Germany received letters saying their captured relatives were healthy and treated correctly, it undermined remaining faith in Nazi pronouncements. Werner's letter to his wife in December 1944 stated, I am well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work, we eat, we are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about POW treatment. His wife, living in bombed Hamburg, shared the letter with neighbors. The information rippled through her community. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment was false, what else were lies? The atomic weapons? The promises of miracle victories? The justifications for continuing a hopeless war? British authorities understood these letters' strategic value. Allowing prisoners to write home served intelligence purposes. Censors learned about German morale and conditions, and psychological warfare objectives. Letters undermined Nazi propaganda among German civilians. The transformation. Extended captivity in British camps created ideological transformations among many German prisoners who compared their treatment with Nazi principles. The transformation process was gradual. Initial shock at humane treatment gave way to grudging acceptance that the British weren't the monsters propaganda depicted. This opened questions. If that propaganda was false, what else were lies? The racial theories? The claims about Jewish conspiracy? The entire ideological foundation of the regime they'd fought for? Hans Schmidt described his evolution in the camp. I had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement. I saw the British treating us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. I talked to other prisoners who admitted Nazi ideology was bankrupt. I read British newspapers, heavily censored, but still providing information we'd never received in Germany. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding. I'd fought for evil. I'd believed lies. The British, who defeated and imprisoned me, were more honourable than the regime I'd served. British authorities recognised this transformation potential and eventually implemented formal re-education programs, though many prisoners had already abandoned Nazi belief simply through experiencing British fairness contrasted with Nazi brutality. The voluntary stays. When German prisoner repatriation began in 1946-47, thousands volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily to continue agricultural work. The British government, facing continued labour shortages, permitted prisoner volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 German former POWs remained in Britain through 1948, working on farms and in reconstruction projects while living in civilian housing. Hans Schmidt was among them. I had nothing to return to. My city was rubble, my family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, housing, and the possibility of rebuilding life. Many of us stayed voluntarily. We'd been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps we could build futures here as workers. This voluntary retention demonstrated the success of British POW policy. Prisoners treated fairly became willing workers. Men who'd fought against Britain chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. The transformation from enemy prisoners to voluntary workers validated the theory that decent treatment created cooperation. The British self-image. The restrained, fair treatment of German prisoners reflected and reinforced British self-conception about national character and civilized values. Britain saw itself as a bastion of civilization against barbarism. Maintaining civilized standards in POW treatment, even when dealing with enemies who'd fought for an explicitly barbaric regime, confirmed this self-image. British fairness to German prisoners demonstrated moral superiority more effectively than cruelty would have. This wasn't naive idealism. It was a calculating demonstration of civilization strength. By treating prisoners properly while Germans treated Allied prisoners and everyone else brutally, Britain proved which side represented civilization and which represented barbarism. Captain Robert Ashford, camp commander at Camp 174, articulated this clearly. We are fighting to defend civilization against Nazi barbarism. If we abandon civilized standards in how we treat prisoners, we've lost what we are fighting to preserve. Our restraint, our fairness, our adherence to rules even when dealing with men who fought for evil, this proves we are right and they're wrong more clearly than any propaganda could. The moral victory. The British treatment of German POWs represented a strategic victory beyond the military defeat of Nazi Germany. Britain demonstrated that civilization could maintain moral standards under war's pressures. Democratic society could fight total war without abandoning civilized values. Victors could treat defeated enemies with dignity. These weren't weaknesses. They were strength. For German prisoners who experienced this firsthand, the lesson was undeniable. Britain had defeated them militarily and defeated them morally by showing that civilization meant more than Nazi propaganda had ever understood. Sergeant Major Thompson summarized it simply. We beat them fair and square, then we treated them like soldiers rather than animals. We didn't do it because they deserved it. Most had fought for evil. We did it because maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies proves civilization's strength. That's how you win wars properly. Defeat them on the battlefield, then show them what they were really fighting against by treating them better than their own government ever did. The lasting memory. 4 German veterans who'd been British POWs. The memory of fair treatment in circumstances where cruelty would have been understandable remained a defining experience. Werner Hartmann, who lived until 2001, maintained contact with British veterans throughout his life. In a 1995 interview, he reflected, "The British could have treated us brutally. We'd fought against them, killed their soldiers, supported a regime that committed atrocities. They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they treated us with firm fairness. That taught me more about civilization than 12 years of Nazi education ever did. That restraint, that adherence to standards even when dealing with enemies, that was real strength. I learned what democracy and civilization actually mean, not from books, but from being imprisoned by people who practiced those values even toward men who'd fought against them." The quiet decency of British POW camps. The rain-soaked camps where German prisoners received tea and fair treatment. Where guards maintained order through discipline rather than terror. Where enemies were treated as defeated soldiers rather than subhuman criminals. These became a testament to civilization's resilience. Britain proved that even in total war against an explicitly evil regime, civilized nations could maintain civilized standards. The grey English mornings when German prisoners received adequate food and fair treatment demonstrated truths more powerful than any propaganda. That real strength includes restraint, that victory doesn't require vengeance, and that treating enemies with dignity when you've defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could prove. For the thousands of German prisoners who expected brutality but received fairness, who anticipated starvation but received adequate food, who feared torture but experienced professional treatment, the British camps became their first real encounter with functioning civilization. And for Britain, the successful management of 400,000 enemy prisoners with minimal mortality and the eventual transformation of many into voluntary workers and democracy advocates proved that civilized values weren't weakness, but the foundation of lasting victory. Thank you for watching. To uncover more hidden stories from the war, please subscribe to The Hidden Past.